Hello, and welcome to Autology, the podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. Today's episode is called Robotaxi What's the Latest on Driverless Cars? And you're here with me, Alicia Thaklalal, and S&P Global Mobility's autonomy experts, Owen Chen, alongside Brock Walquist. Hello to you both, and thank you for joining Autology today.
Hi,
Hi,
everyone.
Alicia.
Lovely to have you both here. So, today's podcast, like I mentioned, is all about sort of autonomous taxis or so called robotaxis and mobility services in general. The first question that I really have for you guys is what's the current status of autonomous driving and robotaxis in your respective regions? I mean, how about we start with mainland China and APAC in general, Owen, where you're based?
Thanks for these questions. I think this question really differs between different regions. Yeah. So first, the China's regulation is one of the best from the global wise. I think both China central government and also the local cities. Both of them support the robotaxi regulations in China, and also the industry players like Baidu, Apollo, Pony AI, and WeRide. They all of them have the robotaxi deployment in the pilot zones like Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou cities. This is the status for China. But Japan and South Korea are the fast followers in China. Yeah. For example, South Korea also announced the mobility innovation roadmap. The authority already set a target to launch the robo taxi or level 4 cars after 2027. Yeah. But the things will be different in India. Yeah? For example, for the moment, there's no any autonomous driving regulation in India, and what's more, the local authority also rule out the technology to India because they want to save the driver jobs. Yeah, so the industry also have nothing planned yet, yeah, for India market. I think the region difference is quite much, and China is the leader in the APEC region.
Understood. That's super interesting regarding India as well, with the impact it will have on jobs. And Brock, what about where you're based in the US? How's things developing out there?
Yeah, I think there's certainly momentum here. I'll start on the topic of regulation. Overall, the U.S. is very dependent on state level policy opposed to federal policy. We're starting to see some momentum at the federal level. Looking for opportunities to create national consistency and national guidelines for some of these mobility as a service deployments. But otherwise, we have about 80% of United States states with some sort of legality around autonomous vehicle deployment or testing, which is great. However, that does create some complications for those involved as navigating deployment guidelines, testing guidelines vary state by state. Now, quite a bit of this momentum is out in the southwest of the country, looking at California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas as a few core states, but many others as well. And really, this concentration in the southwest is where we see some pretty significant momentum. There's been news recently looking at some commercial deployments from companies like Waymo and Cruise, which is a big step in the right direction after kind of resetting expectations within the last few years of when autonomous vehicles will ultimately be feasible in the market. So, overall, I think a lot of opportunity, um, quite a bit of positive momentum, but still ways to go before we consider mass adoption.
Okay, understood. And you mentioned there's like certain pockets where robotaxis are operating, but do you think that robotaxis will kind of achieve widespread adoption? And if so, when? And also, what's the impact of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely more of a long term goal. So to answer your question, probably not until 2030 do we really expect to start seeing some mass deployments. For now, very geographically specific deployments. If we think about what some of the perceived leaders are doing in the United States, and we'll take a Waymo for example. Waymo really focusing on some concentrated deployments in the Metro Phoenix area. They've continued expanding the geography and geofenced areas that they're able to use. While also looking at other strategic cities to potentially launch in, such as Los Angeles most recently. But as we kind of relate this back to our forecast, ultimately we don't expect the market to break 100,000 units until 2030, um, which kind of gives an idea of when we start to expect more widespread adoption and really costs to come down of these robotaxi services, consumer acceptance to start to increase, and ultimately the safety of these systems to meet what the industry needs.
And Owen, from a Chinese point of view, do you see it being widespread anytime soon?
From my side, I think the widespread adoption remains at least a decade away. Yeah. So I agree with Brock that I think the China and US will account for the majority of the robotaxi in the future. But I'm basically conservative for the not only for China but also the global robotaxi deployment. Yeah. So it's a long-term topic. I think for the moment, US is lead the robotaxi deployment, and China um, has the potential, yeah, to lead the future long-term robotaxi after 2030, for example. And I think in by 2035, our global focus for the robotaxi will less than 1 million units globally. And I think China have potential to make the more than 50% share compared with global in 2035. Yeah. So the reason behind about this, I think, why China is quite positive on this, and why global is include China is conservative is really depends on the many factors like regulation, cost, and safety. And one thing is consumer survey. So as we can see that um, we did a consumer survey last year, and the results shows the mainland China represents the highest share about the most desired AD features globally. But compared with the ADAS and active safety features, the consumers prefer this safety-based features. Basically, the result is more than 90%. And for the level 4 cars, even for China, the highest range is the 80%. And if we look at the globally, like United Kingdom, like Germany, the most desired rate is will be lower than 40%. I think the consumer accepted will be the key enabler of this topic.
Okay, understood. And sorry, just to follow up on that topic you just mentioned there, it'll be interesting to know. I mean, is China's adoption of autonomous vehicles and robotaxis more prevalent because arguably the infrastructure is currently less developed than, say, in England or Germany? And then you can create sort of smart cities from scratch. Is that the kind of reason why?
For the moment, the robotaxi industry fully rely on the technology sensors. Yeah. For example, most of the robotaxi have many radar, camera, and lidars. Yeah. And the difference between China and, for example, Germany is I think Germany are more conservative for the technology. For example, if we look at the robotaxis in Germany or robo shuttles in European side, the sensor units are much heavily. Yeah. So around 30 to 40 sensors in their vehicles. But if we look at the robotaxis in China, yeah, so the China robotaxis only have 10 to 20 sensors in the vehicles. Yeah. The total cost is quite cheaper than the European and US side. Basically, the taxi in China also cheaper than European and US side. So I think the cost is also another reason that Chinese customers need affordable robotaxi solution in China.
Okay, understood. That's super interesting. Thanks for that. And then, so when we get to a position where we're kind of widespread, or even now, who would you say will be or are currently the key players in each of your regions?
So if we look at the robotaxi players in China, I would rank the Baidu, Pony, and WeRide as the current leaders for the robotaxi providers. But we cannot underestimate the development progress from the OEMs. For example, Guangzhou Automotive and SAIC, they also have the mobility plan for the future. Yeah. For example, Guangzhou Automotive have lots of collaborations with WeRide, with Didi, and they also have the internal development plan for the robotaxi development. And if we look at outside China in the APEC region, Japan and South Korea are the single market. Toyota and Hyundai will rule this market in their region.
Yeah, and I think if we take a step back and look at the United States, I talked a little bit about Waymo and Cruise and some of the momentum that they have, and they really seem furthest along. But thinking about some others, Zoox, Motional, Aurora, to mention a few, but several others, Apple, May Mobility, Pony AI, We Ride. There's many involved in this space and involved in early testing, kind of preparing for a commercial deployment phase that early leaders Waymo and Cruise are currently in. So that's some of the landscape that we see now. I wouldn't necessarily discount other OEMs willing to jump back in the space. As Volkswagen is an example of one of those OEMs that seems ambitious to get involved in L4 mobility. Looking at Austin, Texas, as a early testing location later this year, and eventually wider commercial deployments targeted around 2025, 2026. So for right now, many technology companies that we see in this space, preparing for commercial phases, but others kind of looming to also get involved.
Okay, and you made an interesting point there, Brock. You mentioned VW there. It would be interesting to know who do you think would kind of come out on top in terms of OEMs versus tech companies? I mean, OEMs obviously are specialists in making cars, but the tech companies obviously have the technology for robotaxis to operate. Who do you think will be more dominant in the robotaxi space?
Yeah, and I think one of the big differences between the United States and China, and Owen will continue to talk about this as well, is in the United States we see a bit more momentum from our technology providers and technology companies versus OEMs. Now that doesn't mean OEMs won't get involved, as you mentioned the Volkswagen example. Um, but others that we're keeping an eye on are Tesla, and Cruise is a General Motors subsidiary. We think about Motional, which is a joint venture between Hyundai Motor Group and Aptiv. So there is OEM involvement in different ways. But also when we think about maybe what happened with Ford and Argo AI within the last year or so, Ford choosing to divest from Argo AI and really the pursuit of level 4 technology for now, with more focus on level 2 plus technologies, level 3 technologies that you would see in passenger cars, kind of quoting more immediate opportunities to increase revenue, profits, and recoup some of the revenue that was ultimately put into mobility investments prior. So definitely OEMs involved. I won't necessarily call out a single OEM that we expect to end up on top amongst the group. But I think it'll be interesting to keep an eye on how the mobility as a service landscape continues to progress, and how OEMs ultimately choose to stay out of the picture or get involved and make waves through the industry.
Yes, great. So I think there's also some collaboration between OEMs and technology companies. For example, Geely-based brand Dicker is providing the purpose-built vehicle to Waymo. Yeah? So the future declared robotaxi may sold to the American. Yeah? And also Pony in collaboration with Toyota. Yeah? So Toyota China, Guangzhou Automotive, Toyota joint venture formed a three-party joint venture to enable the robotaxi mass production in the future in China. I think both technology companies and OEMs are expected to have a significant presence in the robotaxi market with their expertise and resources necessary to create scale in the future.
Okay, understood. Thank you for that. And then just going back to something you mentioned, Brooke, and Owen, you did earlier as well, costings. Of course, that's got a significant impact. Can you tell us more about how technology and, more importantly, the operating costs, how are they evolving right now at this early stage of commercialization?
Yes, this is quite interesting. Yeah. And so at the beginning, I have shared my insight. I'm a little bit conservative because conservative is good for the focus of robotaxi industry. I think for the moment, we are in the technical demonstration phase. Yeah. If we define the current stage as stage one, yeah, I think in total we have three stages. Yeah. So stage three will be the future mobility revolution. Yeah. So the transportation model will be changed and our ways of the transportation will be influenced. But for the moment, we are still in the phase one, yeah, for the stage one as a technical demonstration. Uh, the robotaxi players need to prove the safety and also the deployments of the robotaxi are limited in some pilot cities. Yeah. And the next step will be the mass production, yeah, to reduce costs and optimize technology and also the conformity of the production is the key on this topic. Yeah. To reach the mass production, so OEM and technology company need to cooperate together. OEM need to deliver the purpose-built vehicles. For example, for the moment, Baidu already collaborate with OEM in China. They want to further reduce cost in the future and deliver the purpose-built vehicles. They're similar for the WeRide, Pony, and other technology providers. I think the mass production will be the very important stage two, yeah, to reduce cost via the purpose-built vehicle solutions.
Yeah, and I think if we look at this from another angle, and I think Owen touched on it pretty well, the importance of sensor cost coming down, especially when we think about the number of sensors that are going into these AVs. Sometimes upwards of 40 sensors per vehicle when we're talking about camera, radar, and lidar, and lidar obviously being a very high cost and fairly new sensor to the market, but also very high resolution cameras, high resolution radars. These are all high cost sensors that go into ultimately a high cost vehicle, but also looking at it from an optimization perspective of the entire operation. And if we look at Cruise, for example, Cruise quoting a 15% average monthly decrease in cost per mile for the first 6 months of 2023. Ultimately, from different sorts of optimizations that they made, infrastructure, process improvements, etc. Now, what does 15% mean if your cost per mile is extremely expensive? Not a whole lot. But ultimately, Cruise is targeting costs below $1 per mile, which would go a long way in creating an option that for consumers that may be hesitant in moving away from your traditional ride-hailing vehicles, your traditional Ubers and Lyfts in the United States, or even taxis in large cities like San Francisco or New York City. If there's a cost threshold such as less than $1 per mile, maybe consumers will be more willing to try out a new technology that they were previously hesitant to get in a vehicle like that. So that's some of the process we see, and some of the targets, some of the cost targets that are being used by major players in the U.S. market.
Yes, $1 per mile in U.S. market is a target for the cruise, but if we look at China, yeah, so $1 per mile is much more expensive, yeah, than the conventional taxis. Yeah. So the China markets need to reduce further regarding the cost. Yeah. For example, the LiDAR, yeah, as you mentioned, in the past, as we can see, the LiDAR price in more than 10 years before, yeah, for example, 2027. I remember the LiDAR cost in that phrase was around 70,000 US dollar, yeah, for example, for the mechanical LiDAR in the market. But as of today, if we look at the LiDAR price in the consumer vehicles in China market, you can see the LiDAR price is just 2 to 3 thousand RMB. Yeah, is quite cheap, and with the scaling up, this LiDAR cost will be further reduced. And what's more, the technology innovation will also drive the change. In the past, it was the mechanical LiDAR, and in the future, it will be the solid LiDAR. I think in the 2030s, the LiDAR cost will be reduced heavily. Yeah. So the total cost of the vehicle will also be reduced. Yeah. As Baidu announced in the past, last year, the first purpose-built version of their RT6 will around 250,000 RMB per vehicle. It equals $37,000 around this. Yeah. So the cost reduction from the whole supply chain is quite comprehensive, yeah, for the moment. Yeah.
Okay, understood. And actually, in following up on what you both just said there, and just before we wrap up today's episode, actually, I mean, it'll be interesting to know. I mean, in your idea of utopia, when robotaxis are widely adopted, everything is autonomous, will there still be a need for private car ownership?
For my case, I based in Beijing, yeah, so the things will be a little bit interesting because Beijing has a limitation on the total number of new cars annually. So the car registration will be allocated by a license plate lottery system. So from my side, I hope the robotaxi could help to reduce or remove the limitation, yeah, so I can have more freedom to purchase a car in the China mega cities. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective here in the U.S., um, I definitely plan to be dependent on a personally owned private vehicle for the long term future, 2035 and beyond. But definitely an increased willingness to take a robo taxi service, within a densely populated city in any sort of situation that I might order an Uber or Lyft now, considering an autonomous robo taxi, some sort of autonomous service to fill that void. And when we just talked about cost for less than $1 a mile, that sounds pretty terrific to me. So, well, I do anticipate having my own vehicle for quite some time. I'm looking forward to what the future may hold with robo taxis around some of our biggest cities and many metropolitan areas moving forward.
And final quick one, if you had that dream car, Brock and Owen, what would it be?
My own dream car. I don't know. Make it fancy. I'll take a McLaren.
And Owen?
My dream car will be a Xpeng G9. So Xpeng G9 can be a robotaxi or a private car. I hope when I work at office, my private car can go outside and be a robotaxi and make money for me. So um, he can help me to make money.
That's a wonderful way to think about it. And on that point, that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to you both for joining Autology.
Yes, and thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to all you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@spglobal.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.